Joining us first to discuss this topic, we have Arvind Mahajan, who is a savings professor of finance at the Texas A&M University, who's joining us from College Station in Texas. Arvind, thank you very much for being here. I first want to look at the aligning that the US are looking for with both Canada and Mexico to also impose tariffs on China. Is this Donald Trump looking to almost use tariffs as a threat to get what he wants? We've seen it once before already, and is he doing it once again?
I think you're absolutely right. The tariffs per se are a good threat to achieve a few other ends. And clearly, the threat of imposing tariffs, as you will see, since the administration has come, we've not seen actual tariffs, but only the threats of tariffs. And the intentionality, at least from my perspective, is to achieve some other ends rather than just imposing tariffs.
Yes, and of course we are referencing there to the troop movement that we saw from both Canada and Mexico, also a work to stop the supply of drugs. But Arvind, staying with you, if these 25% tariffs are introduced on Tuesday as is planned, what could the impact be for the US directly?
Well, in the short run, my guess is because they have to be filled with domestic supplies. It is true that timber and lumber are one of the few things where the US has abundance of, and therefore importing them is not a dire necessity. But it will take time for the new supplies to come in while the new supplies become more expensive. So there's an adjustment period here. So if indeed these tariffs go through, in the short run, there could be a price increase. In the long run, in the context of lumber, I don't think there'll be a significant amount of price increase because US has ample amount of lumber domestically. It just does not supply that much. And the argument has been that the imports coming in from Canada, from Brazil, some from China as well, are coming in because they are the prices at which they have been exported from these countries are artificially low. That has really been the argument behind this. But lumber is one of those things where in the long run, the US would not have any meaningful impact on the US economy in the long run. But short term, yes, there could be an increase in the price.
Yes, also joining us to discuss this topic is Ross Feingold, a political risk analyst who's joining us from Taipei in Taiwan. Ross, thank you very much for your time. I want to look at the potential tariffs that we might see on Tuesday for Canada and Mexico. Of course, relationships between those nations have been strained since the start of Trump's administration. But in your view, is this tariff and those tariffs for those nations something that they will work as hard as they can to avoid? We know negotiations have been ongoing, though Canada have also spoken out publicly about Donald Trump and his use of tariffs.
Well, certainly Canada and Mexico want to avoid the imposition of these tariffs next week. They were able to avoid the imposition a month ago. They made some concessions to President Trump on border security and some other issues. And we'll see if in the next 48 hours that they could make similar or additional concessions and persuade President Trump not to impose these tariffs. I'd also like to follow up quickly on some of the excellent points that Professor Mahajan made, and that is when we see the United States putting pressure on Mexico and Canada to match the tariffs that the US has imposed on China, we're seeing the Trump administration return to what in the first Trump administration was called the whole of government approach, where they expect different government agencies to have a China policy. And in this case, we see the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, the US Trade Representative, as well as the State Department, really all being behind a China policy and trying to put pressure on trading partners and what are typically positive relations with Mexico and Canada, and putting pressure on them to match the China policies of the United States. So we're also seeing this whole of government approach once again currently manifesting itself in the trade space.
Ross, staying with you, what sort of response do you expect that we may get from China if Canada and Mexico agree to tariffs on the Asian nation? Do you think there will be a rebuttal, or do you think there might be counter tariffs and imports placed?
there would be a rebuttal and counter tariff. So if China sticks with its approach that it's had recently, they'll identify additional U.S. products to immediately put higher tariffs on. They'll also initiate investigations into other U.S. exports to China and say they're investigating for low price dumping allegations. And they might also make life difficult for U.S. companies operating in China, which is another tool that China has in its toolbox that it frequently uses, such as auditing American companies operating in China. That could be tax related, it could be environmental related, it could be labor policy related, but certainly there would be retaliatory action from China.
Arvind, coming to you to end this discussion, of course, your background in finance. For our audience, can you just explain why Donald Trump might be following this path with tariffs? Because we've spoken on this programme previously that it might mean a price increase for the people living in America on certain goods that are facing these tariffs. So what is his overall goal and motive, and how could that play out over the course of his 4-year term and also moving forward?
Yeah, so I mean, that is actually a very complicated question. So the end game, at least to me, is very clear. And the end game is to contain China. That is, I mean, in geopolitics, economics is just a part of the play. But the larger issue is how do we contain China and how can we reduce, at least from the US perspective, the threat of China damaging US interests globally, both politically as well as economically. And I think the Trump game has been driven primarily with that objective in mind. And tariffs are one of the devices which can be used to influence behavior of our trading partners and of course of China as well. So what we are interested, from the US perspective, I think what we are interested in is not just influencing the behavior of our trading partners, which is Mexico and Canada, but also Europe as well. And Ukraine becomes a small part of that play because you're again trying to influence the behavior of Europeans vis-a-vis the Russians, vis-a-vis the Chinese, vis-a-vis the Americans. So I think the end game is not just economic. It is a much larger game, which is political, has military implications, strategic implications as well. So I think the focus, the bigger focus is towards that, and the means to that end are through economic measures, and one of the economic measures is tariffs. Now, unfortunately, from my viewpoint, I don't think this is the most potent method to influence that behavior, but it certainly can have an impact in the short run. Tariffs do not help any country. It is not a zero-sum game, and that is why proponents of free trade believe that there should not be impediments to free trade because the pie becomes larger. And the moment we start imposing tariffs, and I'm not saying that Trump is imposing tariffs, the effects are coming from various directions, but in aggregation, tariffs unfortunately do not enhance global well-being.
Arvind, thank you very much for your insight there, and thank you for joining us.